If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." Rhonda Casto texted these words days before she plunged to her death from an Oregon cliff. The sun dipped low over the Columbia River Gorge, casting golden light on the cliffs of the Eagle Creek Trail. Rhonda Casto bent to tighten her hiking boots, glancing back at Stephen Nichols, her boyfriend. He lingered behind her, his face set in a distant expression. Rhonda grinned, trying to lighten the mood. "Well, Stephen," she teased, "this could be the day you finally give me a ring. Or, throw me off a cliff." Her laugh rang out, genuine and playful, echoing against the gorge. But Stephen didn't laugh. He barely looked at her, his expression unreadable. Her stomach churned. She tried to shake it off. Stephen was just being Stephen, quiet, brooding. It was a joke, after all. Rhonda had always been the light in the room, the kind of woman whose energy made strangers feel like friends. She was vibrant, ambitious, and fiercely devoted to her 9-month-old daughter. After the baby arrived, her modeling dreams faded into the background, replaced by her determination to give her daughter the best life possible. But lately, life felt hollow. Stephen, once her anchor, seemed to be drifting. His love had turned cold, his presence distant. The promises he made now felt like empty words, and the silence between them had grown into a wall she couldn't breach. The trail ahead was narrow and slick from recent rain, the rocks treacherous. Rhonda loved hiking. It was one of the few things that made her feel alive. But today felt different. The air carried a chill that crawled under her skin. An unease tightened in her chest. Stephen had insisted on this hike, ignoring the forecast for worsening weather. The forest whispered around them, leaves rustling in the breeze, the distant hum of a waterfall breaking the silence. Stephen walked ahead, his shoulders hunched, as if carrying an invisible weight. Rhonda followed, frustration and doubt tangling in her thoughts. She wanted to ask why he'd been pulling away, why his promises of marriage seemed like distant memories. Stephen stopped abruptly and turned. "Rhonda," he said quietly, "if anything ever happened to you, you'd trust me to take care of our daughter, right?" The question hit her like a punch to the gut. She stopped, her breath catching. "What?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why would you say that?" Stephen's face betrayed nothing. She forced a laugh, trying to lighten the heavy air. "Nothing's going to happen to me, Stephen. Don't be weird." He didn't respond. Overhead, clouds thickened, swallowing the last of the sunlight as drizzle began to fall. Rhonda tightened her jacket and quickened her steps, hoping to escape the unease curling in her chest. The trail narrowed into a ledge barely wide enough for one person. Below, jagged rocks lined the misty canyon floor. "Be careful, Rhonda." "It's slippery," Stephen called, his tone sharper than she expected. She turned to reply, but her foot slipped on the wet ground. For a terrifying moment, she teetered on the edge, arms flailing. She caught herself and let out a shaky laugh. "That was close," she said, her voice trembling. Stephen stepped closer, his face shadowed by the rain. His expression was unreadable, but something about it sent a chill through her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, snapping her back to reality. It was her mother calling. She pulled the phone out with trembling fingers, her earlier text flashing in her mind. "He's either going to give me a ring or throw me off a cliff." The words no longer seemed funny. Before she could answer, Stephen's voice broke the silence. "Rhonda," he said softly, stepping closer, "don't take another step." Her breath hitched. She turned to face him, the phone slipping from her hand and clattering onto the rocks. The rushing waterfall faded into eerie silence as Stephen's eyes locked on hers. The air between them felt charged, heavy with something unspoken, something she wasn't sure she wanted to understand. The silence pressed down, broken only by the distant roar of the waterfall. Rhonda's heart pounded as Stephen's words rang in her ears. "Don't take another step." His tone sent a chill through her that the cold wind couldn't explain. "What are you talking about?" she asked, forcing a nervous laugh that sounded hollow. Stephen didn't answer. His piercing gaze held a mix of emotions she couldn't unravel: fear, concern, or something darker. Instinctively, she stepped back, but the narrow ledge offered no escape. Behind her, the cliff loomed, the mist shrouding the jagged rocks below. The rain intensified, soaking her to the skin. The ground turned slick and treacherous. Her phone lay forgotten where it had fallen, its screen blinking with her mother's name. But her focus was locked on Stephen, his tense posture and unreadable expression. "Stephen," she said, her voice trembling, "you're scaring me. What's going on?" For a fleeting moment, his expression softened: regret, guilt, perhaps both. Before she could react, he grabbed her arm. His grip was too strong, sending a jolt of panic through her. "You don't understand," he murmured, his words barely audible over the wind. "You're making everything harder." "Harder?" Her voice cracked. Twisting her arm, she tried to pull free. "Stephen, let go! What are you doing?" The world seemed to collapse into a single, unbearable moment. The roar of the waterfall, the pounding rain, all of it faded. There was only the fear clawing at her chest and Stephen's contorted face, a mask of desperation and anger. Then it happened. Her foot slipped, the wet ground giving way beneath her. She gasped, arms flailing for something to hold on to. Stephen's grip loosened, but whether by instinct or intent, she couldn't tell. Her scream tore through the gorge, raw and primal, echoing against the cliffs. Time warped as she fell, the air rushing past like a cruel whisper. The jagged rocks below loomed closer, closer, until pain exploded through her body, sharp and unforgiving. Her breath seized, her vision blurred, and then nothing. Only silence and suffocating darkness. Stephen stood frozen on the narrow trail, his breath shallow and uneven. Rhonda's scream lingered in the air, echoing faintly before the roar of the waterfall swallowed it completely. The rain lashed against him, soaking through his clothes, but he didn't notice. His eyes stayed fixed on the spot where she had vanished. Moments ago, she had stood there, alive and full of fight. Now there was only rushing water and the faint tremor in his legs. Minutes blurred into what felt like hours before his body finally obeyed his mind's desperate commands to move. He scrambled down the treacherous slope, slipping on the wet rocks, his breath sharp and ragged. Each step brought him closer to the ravine and the truth he wasn't ready to face. When he reached the bottom, the sight before him made his knees buckle. Rhonda lay sprawled among the jagged rocks, her body broken and eerily still. Her pale, rain-soaked form was a ghostly shadow of the vibrant woman she had been. Her limbs were twisted at unnatural angles, her hair clinging to her face. Water trickled around her, mingling with dark pools of blood seeping from unseen wounds. Stephen hesitated, his heart pounding in his ears. Kneeling beside her, his hand trembled as he reached for her shoulder. For a moment, he thought he saw her chest move, the faintest rise and fall. "Rhonda?" he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of hope and dread. Her eyelids fluttered weakly, and a shallow, rattling breath escaped her lips. She was alive, barely. Her eyes flickered open, locking onto his with a pain that hit him like a physical blow. "Help!" she gasped, her voice barely audible. Stephen patted his pockets frantically until he found his phone. But as he feared, there was no signal. He cursed under his breath, his panic mounting as he looked back at her trembling form, the rain relentless. She was fading before his eyes, each breath shallower than the last. And then a thought crept into his mind. She was suffering. Stephen knelt closer, his hands trembling as he cradled her face. Her skin was cold, her breaths uneven. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Rhonda. I'm so sorry." Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Her eyes fluttered shut, her breaths fading. Stephen sat there, frozen, the weight of his actions crushing him. He replayed the last moments on the trail, the fight, the fall, and now this. His thoughts turned to their daughter, the life insurance policy, and the lies he had told himself to survive each day. "It wasn't my fault," he murmured, desperation creeping into his voice. "It was an accident. It had to be." Yet a darker voice whispered otherwise. He stayed with her until the life finally slipped from her body, the rain washing away her blood, but not his guilt. When he climbed back to the trailhead, drenched and numb, he left her behind in the ravine. When the paramedics arrived, they found Rhonda's lifeless body among the rocks. Stephen told them his story, a tragic accident, a terrible twist of fate. But the truth? The truth stayed buried in the shadows of the gorge, unreachable and haunting, just like Rhonda herself. When the rescue team reached the gorge, the rain had softened to a drizzle, but the air was heavy with tension. The responders moved carefully, their boots crunching on the slick rocks as they approached Rhonda's body. Her pale skin stood out starkly against the rain-soaked terrain, a haunting sight that etched itself into their minds. At the trailhead, Stephen stood motionless, drenched, arms wrapped around himself. His face was hollow, his responses clipped and robotic. "She slipped," he repeated flatly. "I tried to grab her, but the ground was too slick. By the time I got down there, it was too late." The responders nodded, but unease flickered beneath their calm exteriors. Stephen's words felt rehearsed, devoid of grief. "Why didn't you stay with her?" one asked, neutral but probing. Stephen hesitated. I couldn't call for help down there. I thought—" His words faltered, trailing off. When Rhonda's family arrived, her mother's anguished cries shattered the stillness. She clung to a paramedic for support, barely able to stand. As she neared Stephen, her tear-streaked face searched his for answers, but he avoided her gaze. "She would never leave her baby," Rhonda's mother whispered to an officer, trembling. "She loved her daughter more than anything. This doesn't feel right." Her suspicions grew. Stephen's behavior deepened the unease. At the memorial service, he left early, citing exhaustion. Days later, he packed up and moved across the state with their daughter, leaving Rhonda's family stunned. To them, it felt like a quiet confession of guilt. Friends shared troubling details about Stephen, the bruises Rhonda tried to hide, the arguments, and her growing fear of him. One friend revealed a chilling text Rhonda had sent days before her death. "If anything happens to me, don't believe it was an accident." Authorities initially ruled her death accidental, blaming the trail's slippery conditions. But Rhonda's mother refused to let the case close. Fueled by grief and determination, she pushed investigators relentlessly, pointing to the bruises, the life insurance policy Stephen had taken out months before, and his controlling behavior. Years passed, but her persistence never wavered. In 2015, her efforts paid off. Stephen Nichols was arrested at a San Francisco airport, charged with Rhonda's murder. Investigators had pieced together enough circumstantial evidence to reopen the case. The arrest brought bittersweet hope to Rhonda's family. Justice seemed possible, but it reopened old wounds, forcing them to relive the haunting image of Rhonda lying lifeless at the bottom of the gorge. As the trial approached, more questions emerged. The search for justice became a quest for the truth, no matter how painful or dark it might be. The courtroom buzzed with tension, a charged mix of anticipation and dread as the trial began. Rhonda's family filled the gallery, their faces etched with grief and unwavering determination. They clung to the hope that justice, long delayed, might finally arrive. At the defense table, Stephen Nichols sat motionless. He looked older, his face drawn and weary, his expression disturbingly blank, as if detached from the events unfolding around him. The prosecution wasted no time painting a damning picture of Stephen. Piece by piece, they wove a narrative that hinted at a darkness few dared to imagine. They detailed the $1 million life insurance policy Stephen had taken out on Rhonda months before her death, a policy he had increased just weeks prior. They revealed his mounting financial troubles, reckless day trading, and the growing cracks in his relationship with Rhonda. Witness after witness took the stand, their testimonies cutting through the courtroom like shards of glass. Rhonda's friends described the bruises she had tried to hide, and her whispered confessions about Stephen's controlling behavior. Her mother, trembling as she held up Rhonda's phone, read aloud a chilling text Rhonda had sent just days before her death. "He's either going to give me a ring or throw me off a cliff." Her voice broke, and the courtroom fell silent. The medical examiner's testimony sent a ripple of unease through the room. He explained that Rhonda's injuries were concentrated below her waist, a pattern inconsistent with someone tumbling uncontrollably down a rocky slope. The implication was devastating. Rhonda's fall had not been an accident. Stephen's defense team, however, was prepared. His attorney crafted a counter-narrative, casting doubt on the prosecution's case. They argued that Rhonda had struggled with postpartum depression, pointing to therapy notes that painted a picture of a young mother overwhelmed by her reality. They suggested that Rhonda may have taken her own life, a possibility Stephen claimed he had never considered until now. The jury shifted uneasily, the defense's argument striking a raw, painful chord. But it wasn't enough to silence the damning questions surrounding Stephen's actions. The prosecution introduced evidence of his inappropriate relationship with Rhonda's teenage sister, Melanie, a relationship that began long before Rhonda's death. Melanie, now a young woman, took the stand, her voice trembling as she described the manipulation and betrayal she endured. Her testimony painted Stephen as a man who preyed on those closest to him. Stephen's ex-wife also testified, recounting his violent tendencies. She described how, during their marriage, he had once tried to throw her over a railing. The chilling parallel to Rhonda's death left the courtroom in stunned silence. With each witness, The prosecution's case grew stronger, but the absence of direct evidence loomed over the trial. There were no eyewitnesses, no definitive proof that Stephen had pushed Rhonda to her death. The jury wrestled with a web of circumstantial evidence, each thread leading back to the same haunting question. Was Rhonda's death a tragic accident or a calculated act of murder? The tension peaked when Stephen himself took the stand. Calm and measured, he recounted the events of that day, insisting Rhonda's death was a terrible accident. But as the prosecutor pressed him on the life insurance policy and his relationship with Melanie, cracks appeared in his carefully constructed facade. "Why would I kill the mother of my child?" he asked, his voice faltering. The jury wasn't convinced, and neither was Rhonda's family. They came seeking answers, hoping for a confession. But Stephen's testimony only deepened the mystery. Then the unthinkable happened. Just days before deliberation, Stephen's legal team negotiated a plea deal. He pled guilty to the lesser charge of criminally negligent homicide, avoiding a potential life sentence. Rhonda's family was devastated. After years of fighting for justice, the deal felt like a betrayal, a cruel mockery of their loss. Her mother wept openly as the judge announced the agreement. Stephen was sentenced to time served and 3 years of probation. He walked out of the courthouse a free man, leaving behind a shattered family and a reeling community. But the story didn't end there. Months later, Stephen gave an interview that sent shockwaves through everyone who had followed the case. In it, he hinted at a secret so dark, so unexpected, that even the courtroom hadn't heard it, a secret that threatened to change everything. Months after the trial, the cameras once again turned to Stephen Nichols. He sat across from a journalist in a dimly lit studio, shadows casting sharp lines across his face. Time had weathered him. His eyes carried the weight of a man judged not only in court, but in the court of public opinion. Yet Stephen appeared calm, detached, almost unnervingly so. The journalist leaned forward, her voice steady but probing. "Stephen," she began, "there are still unanswered questions about that day. Can you tell us, in your own words, what really happened on the Eagle Creek Trail?" Stephen let out a long breath, his gaze dropping to the table. For a moment, it seemed as though he wouldn't answer. Finally, his voice broke the heavy silence, low and deliberate. "It's not as simple as people think," he said, his tone weighted with something unspoken. "No one knows what it's like to watch someone you love suffer like that, to feel so helpless." The journalist frowned. "Suffer? What do you mean?" Stephen hesitated, the pause suffocating. "When I found her," he said, his voice trembling, "she wasn't gone yet. She was alive, but only just." The journalist's eyes widened. "Are you saying Rhonda was still alive when you reached her?" Stephen nodded, his face a mix of sorrow and something darker, guilt perhaps. "She was in so much pain," he said softly, almost to himself. "Her body, she wasn't going to make it. I knew that." The words hung in the air, oppressive. The journalist leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Stephen," she asked carefully, "are you saying you ended her suffering?" Stephen clenched his fists, his breath uneven. "What would you have done?" he finally said, his voice breaking. "If someone you loved was in agony, knowing they wouldn't survive, what would you have done?" The implication was unmistakable. "Stephen," the journalist pressed, her voice firm, "did you harm Rhonda? Did you end her life?" He didn't answer directly. His eyes locked on the camera, emotions swirling, regret, defiance, and something more elusive. "It wasn't murder," he said finally. "It was mercy." The interview sent shockwaves through the media, reigniting speculation around Rhonda's death. Though Stephen stopped short of explicitly admitting to ending her life, his words fractured public opinion. For Rhonda's family, the interview was devastating. Watching from her living room, Rhonda's mother broke down, her voice thick with grief. "He's lying," she sobbed. "He didn't show her mercy. He stole her from us." Public reaction was sharply divided. Some saw Stephen's words as a manipulative attempt to rewrite history. Others wondered if desperation, not malice, had driven him. But for Rhonda's family, Stephen's words were another betrayal. No confession, wrapped in the guise of mercy, could ever ease the ache of their loss. Rhonda's mother sat at the dining table, the faint glow of the television fading into the dimness of the room. Stephen's words from the interview lingered like a shadow, pressing on her chest with unbearable weight. Each syllable reopened wounds she had tried so hard to live with. Her hand trembled as she clutched a photo of Rhonda, the way she wanted to remember her, vibrant, full of life, her smile radiant. Not the broken figure found at the bottom of the ravine. Not the victim of a man she had once trusted with her daughter's heart. But the memories she tried to cling to were often overrun by those she desperately wanted to forget. They haunted her dreams, each detail replaying in agonizing clarity. Rhonda's laughter, the way her voice lit up a room, and then silence. A silence that consumed her family, leaving behind unanswered questions and a longing for justice that felt out of reach. In the days after the interview, whispers in the community grew louder. Neighbors debated whether Stephen's words were the desperate honesty of a guilt-ridden man or a calculated attempt to manipulate the narrative. For Rhonda's mother, none of it mattered. The truth remained. Her daughter was gone, her granddaughter lost to the foster care system, and the man she believed responsible still walked free. Stephen, meanwhile, withdrew into isolation. The interview had sparked a storm he couldn't control. Reporters hounded him, and strangers hurled accusations of murderer in the streets. Yet Stephen didn't waver, repeating his claim that his actions were out of love, not malice. The case reignited as a media sensation. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail, piecing together timelines like a puzzle. Online forums buzzed with speculation, but every theory returned to the same haunting question: what really happened on the Eagle Creek Trail? For Rhonda's family, the renewed attention was both a blessing and a curse. It kept Rhonda's story alive, but dredged up their pain daily, forcing them to relive their nightmare under harsh public scrutiny. Her younger sister Melanie bore her own burden. The trial had exposed her relationship with Stephen, turning her into a figure of pity and scorn. Manipulated, a victim in her own right, Melanie carried a guilt that weighed heavily on her. Unable to face her family's quiet judgment, she eventually withdrew completely, disappearing into the shadows of her grief and shame. Through it all, Rhonda's mother remained steadfast. She focused on regaining custody of the granddaughter Rhonda had loved so deeply. The legal battles were long and grueling, but she refused to give up, fueled by a love that even death couldn't extinguish. Raising the child became her way of honoring Rhonda's memory. The years passed, but the pain never dulled. Each anniversary of Rhonda's death brought quiet vigils and tearful gatherings. Her family clung to each other, drawing strength from their shared loss and determination to keep Rhonda's memory alive. They spoke of her often, ensuring that the vibrant, loving woman she was would never be overshadowed by the tragedy that took her. Yet the questions lingered. On quiet nights, Rhonda's mother sat alone, staring into the stillness outside her window. Did Stephen push her? Did she fall? Or was the truth something darker, something too painful to fully imagine? These questions followed her, an ever-present shadow she could never shake. They would remain unanswered, a testament to the tragedy that had shattered her world. But Rhonda's story became more than just heartbreak. It was a warning, a reminder of life's fragility, and the dangers that can hide behind familiar faces. It was a call for justice, and a refusal to let the truth be buried alongside her. In the end, Rhonda was more than a victim. She was a daughter, a sister, a mother. And in the hearts of those who loved her, she would forever be a symbol of resilience, love, and the fight for justice. Worth every battle, no matter how elusive it might seem. Years had passed since the courtroom doors closed on Rhonda Casto's case, but for her mother, time had done little to dull the pain. The world had moved on, the headlines fading into memory, but her grief remained fresh, an ache that greeted her every morning. Each day began with the same haunting image, Rhonda's face, her radiant smile frozen in time, followed by the gut-wrenching vision of her disappearing into the abyss. Rhonda's daughter, now older, became a bittersweet reminder of what was lost. Her eyes, so much like her mother's, sparkled with curiosity and warmth. "What was Mommy like?" she would ask, her voice soft and full of wonder. Rhonda's mother always answered, though it wasn't easy. With a lump in her throat, she recounted stories of her daughter's vibrancy, her boundless dreams, and the fierce love she poured into everything she did. She spoke of Rhonda's laughter, how it could light up a room, and the determination that defined her life. As the girl grew older, her questions grew heavier. One evening, as they sat together, the child's voice trembled. "Grandma," she asked, "did Daddy hurt Mommy?" The question pierced deeper than any courtroom cross-examination ever could. Rhonda's mother froze, struggling for words. She held her granddaughter close, shielding her from a truth too heavy for her young heart. "Your mommy loved you more than anything," she said, steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "And sometimes, love is complicated in ways we don't understand." The answer was enough for now, but Rhonda's mother knew the questions would return, sharper, harder, and impossible to avoid. She dreaded that moment, knowing it would bring her granddaughter closer to a truth she could never erase. In the years that followed, Rhonda's mother channeled her grief into purpose. She became an advocate for survivors of domestic violence, standing before crowds to share Rhonda's story. Her voice often wavered, her hands trembling as she spoke, but she pressed on. "This is for you," she would whisper to herself before stepping onto the stage, feeling Rhonda's presence like a guiding hand on her shoulder. She recounted the hidden bruises, the confessions Rhonda had whispered during late-night calls, and the courage it took to fight for justice, even when the odds were stacked against them. Each story she told felt like a way to hold on to her daughter, keeping her memory alive through the power of her voice. But the fight was far from over. Stephen's cryptic claims of innocence and his chilling allusions to mercy haunted her. Determined to uncover the truth, Rhonda's mother worked tirelessly with private investigators, combing through case files, tracking down witnesses, and revisiting overlooked details. One day, her persistence unearthed something unexpected. A photograph buried in the evidence files. It was one Rhonda had taken on the trail that day, showing Stephen standing on the narrow path. His expression was unreadable, but the angle of the photo caught her attention. It seemed hastily taken, as though Rhonda had snapped it in a moment of fear. Her hands trembled as she handed the photograph to the investigators. "Look at this," she said, her voice firm despite the tightness in her chest. "There's something here. There has to be." The photograph reignited quiet conversations in investigative circles, a flicker of hope for Rhonda's mother. It was a fragile chance to uncover the answers she had pursued for so long. The years stretched into decades, and the fight grew harder. The legal battles, the endless waiting, and the heavy scrutiny of the media took their toll. But Rhonda's mother couldn't stop. She wouldn't. As long as she lived, Rhonda's story would not be forgotten. Rhonda's daughter grew into a young woman, carrying her mother's legacy forward. At events and gatherings, she stood beside her grandmother, speaking out against domestic violence and sharing her own journey of growing up in the shadow of loss. Her voice, steady and determined, echoed the strength that had once defined Rhonda. Rhonda's case became more than a mystery. It was a rallying cry for those left behind, a reminder of the fragility of life and the hidden dangers of familiar faces. Though the answers remained elusive, her family found solace in their fight. Rhonda's story had the power to inspire others, to prove that even in unbearable tragedy, love could endure. Rhonda wasn't just a victim. She was a mother, a daughter, a sister, and in the hearts of those who loved her, she became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that in the deepest darkness, the fight for light and justice is always worth it. The years softened the pain but never erased it. For Rhonda's family, life became a balancing act, honoring her memory while trying to move forward. Her daughter, now older, embodied resilience, a living reminder of the life Rhonda had cherished and the love she had left behind. Yet, questions lingered. Each anniversary of Rhonda's death whispered of what might have been, of truths buried with her at the bottom of that gorge. The courtroom verdict had closed a chapter, but the emotional wounds remained raw, etched into her family's hearts. Rhonda's mother, now older with silver-streaked hair, kept a photograph of Stephen on her desk. It wasn't there to haunt her, but as a symbol of the fight she had waged for her daughter. "One day," she would whisper, "the whole truth will come out." For the world, Rhonda's story was a cautionary tale retold in documentaries and forums, a chilling mystery. But for her family, it was deeply personal. A daughter with dreams stolen too soon, a mother's boundless love, and a future cut short. It was also a testament to strength, a mother who refused to let her daughter's memory fade, a little girl growing up under tragedy's shadow yet carrying her mother's light, and a family determined to speak for the silenced. Justice, in its truest form, might never have come. Yet her family found solace in knowing Rhonda was never truly gone. She lived on in her daughter's laughter, her mother's determination, and in the hearts of all who heard her story and vowed to remember. And in the Columbia River Gorge, where the wind whispers through the trees and water roars below, it feels as though her voice still lingers, calling for justice, love, and remembrance. Rhonda Casto was more than a mystery. She was a life that mattered. If Rhonda's story moved you, share it with others. Let her voice be heard. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to join the conversation and help us honor stories that must never be forgotten.